Good morning. Today is the 7th day of the second Adar and the 17th of March. We're starting not just a new Parsha, a new Torah portion, we're also starting a new book, the third book of the Pentateuch, Vayikra in Hebrew, which means he called out, referring to the first verse, which the first time that Moses hears God calling him from within the tent of meeting. And in English they call it Leviticus because that's even a name that's used in Hebrew. In Hebrew it's called Torat Kohanim, the Torah of the priests, which is pretty much what Leviticus means. It means the teachings of the Levites, which is another way of saying the priests, since the priests were all from the tribe of Levite. Levi, they were all the descendants of Aaron, who, like Moses, is a Levite. What we're going to focus on is the first portion, the first reading. And the first reading discusses the burnt offering. And as we go over this book, I'm going to try to give as much as I can about the theory behind the different sacrifices. And already this week, we're going to see the two basic sacrifices, which are called the burnt offering and a sin offering. And these are done differently. They are done in completely different ways. The way that the sacrifice is offered. And it's meant to create, they have different purposes. One, the purpose is more of a gift to God. The burnt offering is more of a gift, and we'll see that. Excuse me. And the sin offering is, of course, an atonement. It's to achieve atonement. And so they have different purposes, and they're done in different ways. We'll talk about that as we go on. But today we're going to focus on the burnt offering, which is the topic of the first reading. And right after, there's so much to say about the first verse, which is what does it mean that God called out to Moses? There's a long explanation about why Moses heard and no one else heard, about the difference between the sound and the voice, or the voice and the speech. Actually, this is the topic that we started talking about this morning in the morning classes, in the Daily Chassidut. You can tune into that to hear more about that tomorrow. But we're going to skip to the second verse. And the second verse, verses 2 and 3 actually, they read, when a man among you brings a sacrifice to God, if his sacrifice is a burnt offering, and then the Torah tells us exactly how it needs to be prepared. What does it mean when a man? So this is a very interesting start, because it says, Adam ki yakriv mikem. This is not the usual way that the Torah talks about a person. It's important to know that in Hebrew there are 4 synonyms to man. Adam, Ish are the 2 most common. Adam is Adam, but it also just means a man. And Ish is a person. That's how we usually translate it. But we also have Gever and Enosh. Gever is literally a masculine form of man. If you would be talking about a woman, you would say Geveret. Gever and Geveret. And Enosh was the grandson of Adam, the first man, Adam and Eve. And he is, for some reason, in Hebrew, when you want to say humanism, you say Enoshiyut. We call the descendants of man Enoshiyim, after Enosh. And why is that? There's a lot to talk about that also. Really, this comes from the form that was used in Aramaic. In Aramaic, the form was Bar Anash, or Barnash, the son of Enosh, but they shortened it to become Nash, just Nash, without the Enosh at the beginning. And this was adopted into Hebrew also. If we're already speaking about this, and we're not getting to the verse yet, and there's so much to say here, I really, first of all, refer you to the Patreon page where this article is going to go up. It's a long article. It's in this week's Wonders. You should read the whole article. But if we're already talking about this connection between Aramaic and Hebrew, Aramaic was the lingua franca, the English of the ancient world. Everybody spoke Aramaic. Almost all Jews spoke Aramaic. And the local language was Hebrew. So there's always a connection between the two. Later on in Kabbalah, which was written like the Zohar, mostly in Aramaic, for reasons that today seem like they were trying to hide something, but it was really the way that people talked. The Talmud is written mostly in Aramaic, the Jerusalem Talmud even more in Aramaic, although it's a different dialect of Aramaic. So there was a special relationship between these two languages, and a lot of people don't know exactly, so what is Hebrew relative to Aramaic? Did it borrow from it or so on? It's important to know that Hebrew was a spoken language even before the Israelites were taken out of Egypt. There was a language that they spoke. It was called Hebrew. And it was called Hebrew because it was spoken by not only Abraham, but by many people who had crossed the river Jordan, coming from the further east, the Middle East, the area of Iraq and Syria, and they moved into the land of Canaan at that time, where today is the land of Israel. And they were called Hebrews because that literally means to cross. They crossed the river. So there was a language that was spoken. It was a Semitic language. It was like all the other languages in the area. They were all Semitic. They were all based on, at least we think they were all based on 3-letter roots. That's the theory today. That the best was Akkadian, the sort of like the mother of all these languages, from where all these languages came from, at least according to the archaeological understanding. The historical evidence seems to point in that way. But when the Israelites received the Torah at Mount Sinai, they received the revealed form of this language. And this revealed form is what we say that God created the world with. It's not the spoken form. Although the spoken form and the revealed form from that moment on became closer and closer, because when people realized that God was revealing himself to them in the language that their ancestors had brought down to Egypt, that they were speaking, that they knew, sort of like Jews around the world today maybe speak Yiddish, or it was a language that they had taken with them, and they suddenly realized God is speaking in this language. It made this language even more valuable to them. And so there was an attempt to more and more speak like the biblical speech, which is what we find, first of all, in the Torah, and then all the prophets in their prophecies. They see this language and they develop it, and that's what spoken Hebrew became closer and closer to. So there's been innovations in spoken Hebrew also, but today they're all based, hopefully they're all based on biblical reference and on some way of understanding the Bible. In any case, so we have this unusual start, which is an Adam, a man among you who brings a sacrifice to God. The usual way that the Torah would say this is ish ki akriv mikem korban Hashem. It would have used the word ish, and here it doesn't. And for that reason, the sages try to figure out, why is it saying Adam? Well, if you hear in Adam, Adam the first man, then you're hearing what they heard. And what did they hear? They heard that to bring a burnt offering is not something that the Torah is saying only to Israelites. It's not saying it only to Jews. It's actually saying it first and foremost, say the rabbis, they're saying it to converts. A convert should also consider themselves to be spoken to in this verse. That should you decide to bring a sacrifice to God, if it's a burnt offering, you should do so and so. By the way, this has a lot of repercussions legally. Who are we talking to? Because although everyone can bring a burnt offering, the laws regarding what the qualifications, the conditions regarding the animal itself and how it's brought and how it's done, those do change whether you're a Jew or a non-Jew. But here it's saying, in the end, the Torah is also speaking again, in this opening verse of all the sacrifices, of the service of God, and saying, you have to be included, even if the laws will change to some degree, but you're included. You have to also feel that God is telling you that you can become closer to Him through divine service. Now it's important to know that the word for sacrifices in Hebrew, korbanot, or just for the singular sacrifice, korban, literally comes from the verb that means to come close. Karev, karav, kuf reish bet. That's the verse. That's the root, and that's what a sacrifice is meant to do. It's meant to bring you closer to God. Now today we don't use sacrifices because we don't have a temple. And we'll be talking about that this week. And what exactly are we missing? Are we missing anything if we've supplanted sacrifices with prayer? It's not that they didn't pray in the time of the temple. They also prayed in the time of the temple. However, the sacrifices offer something that prayer cannot. And we'll try this week to also talk about that, because we have a beautiful article about that. I believe it's in the third reading. You'll be able to see it also on the Patreon page. So that's the first thing they say. This also includes a convert. But then they go further and they say, well, if the word Adam really means Adam, an Adam, a man, then it's not only talking about converts, it is also talking about non-Jews in general. And that is a legal stipulation. It's a legal medrash on Leviticus. It's called Torat Kohanim or Sifra. That a man from among you is phrased with the word man, Adam, because Scripture intends to include all people of the world. And what does this mean? Every sacrifice is an intent to bring my animal soul and place it closer to God. And to not just place it closer to God, the sacrifice of the animal soul is the sacrifice of what sets me separate from godliness. All those things that cause me to feel that I'm separate from God, and therefore I'm also separate from my fellow men. Every single sacrifice is meant to do that. Now quickly, we don't have much time, and there's a lot more to say about this. I want to go to the second part of this article, and there's a beautiful tradition that talks about 4 verses that have this word Adam in them, where man is not called Ish, but rather an Adam. And these 4 verses, well, the first one is, a man should he die in a tent. And this is from Numbers 19:14. Then there's another verse, when a man has on the skin of the body a swelling, a rash, or a discoloration, it's talking about leprosy. That's from Leviticus 13:2. The third verse is, when a man among you brings a sacrifice to God, our verse, and that's from here, Leviticus 1:2. And the fourth verse is actually a verse from Psalms, and it forms in many ways the basis of all our understanding of what sacrifices do. And this is a verse that reads, man and animal you shall save, O God. Adamu vehimat oshia Hashem. And this verse is from Psalms 36:7. A very, very important verse. We'll be looking at it throughout our treatment of sacrifices. And it's basically setting up the connection between man and animal during divine service. So today, when we don't have a temple, so we say this is what we call our animal soul. Our animal soul is what you would call in psychology our anima, our psyche. And our psyche is built in such a way that it needs to be sacrificed, like we said. What needs to be sacrificed is, it's not an act of deprecation, it's not an act of self-mutilation at all. It's an act of getting rid of those things that separate me from God. And the reason that they separate me is because my animal soul has a feeling that it has a separate existence that is not dependent on God. And so that, and we have that all the time. I can go through most of my day And if I'm not thinking constantly of my connection to God and my dependence on God, so that's my animal soul working. That's how it feels. It feels naturally that I'm something independent. So all the sacrifices are a way of connecting man and animal, and here the animal in us is replaced by the animal that's brought for a sacrifice. And we don't have time today. What I want to talk about is these 4 verses, how they correspond to a very important medrash, a very important homiletic interpretation from the rabbis about what do you need in order to receive forgiveness from God? What do you need to do? And unfortunately, we don't have time, but I encourage you to look at the article on our Patreon website, patreon.com/GALEINAI, Galeinai, and I hope to see you tomorrow.